Imagine needing a $10 million bill just to buy a few groceries on Earth, because that is exactly what is happening right now. A political standoff threatens to blow up the rules forever.
We are watching the fundamental machinery of American lawmaking just
it sounds like something from the history
to an
book,
absolute halt.
but the numbers we are looking at today are happening in real time.
That building is
and I have a massive stack of 2026
so let's set
financial reports and geopolitical dispatches right here, and the data paints an incredibly stark picture.
That's grim.
So let me give you the fast-paced rundown of this breaking crisis as of March 2026.
Staffers are
Iran just
stockpiling
introduced a
energy drinks by the
record-breaking
case.
10 million
We are looking
note.
at a scenario where
That
senators might
massive
actively
astronomical
refuse to drink
is
water,
currently worth a
just so
measly
they don't have to leave the
$7
floor to use the restroom.
$7 for 10 million
and it's all
rials.
because the Senate is
hard to wrap your head around.
deadlocked
The Rubble
over
has
the
completely
Save
collapsed,
America
hitting
Act.
1.6
big
million
election
to a single
overhaul bill.
US
Yeah.
dollar. It's centered
And
around
food
measures like
inflation,
voter ID
it has
requirements.
skyrocketed past 70%.
Democrats are aggressively
which is
blocking this
devastating
legislation,
for the average citizen.
and Republicans desperately
Meanwhile,
want
you
to
have
pass
this
it.
massive
lack the 60
multi-dimensional
votes
war
required to
involving
break
the
the
U.S. and
stalemate.
Israel,
Which means
that has basically
frustrations
halted
are
tanker
just
traffic
boiling
in the Strait of
over.
Hormuz.
Today,
And that is a
28
huge
Republican
deal,
senators,
because that
people like
single
Pete Ricketts
maritime
and
choke
Cynthia
point
Loomis
handles
demanding
20%
that
of
the
the
Senate
entire
force
globe's
a
oil
grueling
and liquefied
physical
natural gas
talking
shipments.
filibuster.
Exactly.
They
so
want
we
to
are
force
looking at a
Democrats to
compounding
stand on the
crisis here.
floor
You
and
have
talk until their vocal
localized
cords just
economic
give out. And if that
hyperinflation
fails, they
colliding
want
with
to breach the
regional
standing
kinetic
rules of the Senate
warfare.
entirely.
And that is now
to
transmitting
force a
massive
final vote.
shockwaves.
And the real
into
shocker
global
dropped
energy
just
and
a few
food
days
markets.
ago.
So,
Senator John
welcome
Cornyn,
to this deep dive.
a man who
Our
fiercely
mission today
defended
is
the
to
old
sift
Senate
through
rules
these
for his
newly
entire
released
career,
reports and
just
analyses
published
to
this fiery
really
op-ed.
understand the
saying
severe
Republicans
systemic
must act
collapse
now
of
to
the
get
Iranian
this
economy.
bill passed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
he
figure
said
out
they
how
have
a
to deal
modern
a fatal
state
blow to
reaches
the
the point of
rules,
punting
which
10
instantly
million
triggered a massive
literal
public call out
notes.
from former Senator
How
Joe
they
Manchin.
managed to fund a war
Manchin
while
slammed
effectively
Cornyn
bankrupt,
online for,
and
well,
crucially,
a
what this all
massive
means for
flip-flop.
your
Because
wallet.
the rules of the
Right.
Senate are
Now,
quite
before we
literally
jump into
hanging
the
by
data,
a
we
thread
need to
right
state
now.
something
the
very
decisions
clearly.
made
These
in the next
sources
few days
contain
will
highly
dictate
charged
how
political
American laws are
content
written for
regarding
the
the
next
ongoing
century.
conflicts involving
Welcome
the
to this
US,
deep dive.
Israel, and Iran. Today, we have a custom
Both
mission
left-wing and
tailored
right-wing
just for
viewpoints
you.
are in there.
Exactly. We're going to
And we are not
explore
taking
the
any sides here.
swashbuckling,
We do not
pirate-filled
endorse the
origins
viewpoints of the
filibuster.
original authors,
It is a
nor
crazy
are we making
history.
political
It really is.
judgments.
We'll
Our
also
job
break
is simply
down the terrifying
act
parliamentary
as your
weapon
impartial guide,
known as
just
the
conveying the
nuclear
facts, the
option.
numbers, and the underlying
And finally,
mechanics
we will unpack
exactly
a
as they
mind-bending
appear in the
mathematical
source
concept
Right. The
called
goal
the
is to lift
Manchin
the hood
paradox.
on this
Right,
crisis.
which proves
We wanna
exactly why
understand
politicians
the
use
structural failures
gridlock
within
as
the
a
banking
highly
system
calculated
and,
mathematical strategy.
The shadow
So,
economy
by
that
the end of this
pushed the country
conversation,
to this
you will
specific
hold
breaking
the
point.
secret
Okay,
decoder
let's unpack
ring
this.
for the
We have to start
chaos
with
you
the
see on the
physical money.
news.
The
You will
government just rolled
understand
out
the
this
hidden
new
game
10
theory
million
that
real
drives these
banknote.
high-stakes
pink one.
showdowns.
Yeah,
It's
it's printed
absolutely.
pink.
Okay, let's
It
unpack
features
this.
the historic
Before we can
Jimmy
truly
Mosque of Yazd
grasp
on one
the physical
side
threats
and
and
the
the
ancient
massive
dam citadel
stakes
on the other.
of this
But this note was
2026
not a
FZB
planned
America
economic
Act
milestone.
standoff.
The sources are
We
very
really need to
clear
look at what the
that this was
filibuster
born out of
actually
pure
is.
public
And more
panic.
importantly, how it
Right,
started.
because citizens
Right,
have been
because it
forming
wasn't
massive
designed this way
queues
by
at
the
ATMs
founders, right?
across the
Like this
country.
wasn't in the
There is
blueprint.
this
Not at all.
deep
If you read the
underlying
U.S.
fear
Constitution,
that
you
the
will not
ongoing
find the word
military
filibuster
strikes could
anywhere in the
target or
text.
Wow,
completely
nowhere.
take down the
Nowhere.
electronic
The
payment
Constitution
infrastructure.
basically gives
And
the
when
Senate the
trust in the
authority to
digital
set its
system
own internal
evaporates,
rules.
people demand
So back in
physical cash.
1789,
Exactly.
during the very first
But the
sessions,
problem is the
debates
physical
ended
cash
with
simply
just a
isn't
simple
there.
majority vote. ATMs are running
Okay, so
entirely dry.
51
They're
votes
just
and
empty.
you're done. And the
Exactly.
central banking authorities
there
are
was this
throwing up
massive
strict
loophole.
withdrawal limits to try
They
and stop
never
bank runs.
codified a specific
The timeline
procedure
here
to
is
force
just
a vote
wild,
to happen
honestly.
if
Just
someone
last month,
simply
in
refused
February
to stop
2026,
talking.
they rolled out a $5
So without a
million
mechanism
Virgil
to cut off
Wait,
debate,
just a month prior?
politicians figured
Literally
out they could just
weeks later, in
hold
March,
the floor hostage.
the
They
currency
did.
lost so
We
much
actually have
value they had to
diaries from the
double
very
it
first
to the
session
10
of the
million
Senate.
Virgil note.
Wow. Pennsylvania Senator
And to
William
try and
McClay wrote
mask
down
the
a sheer
psychological
frustration
impact
that
of this
senators from
hyperinflation,
Virginia were
the government is
intentionally
executing a
talking away the
transition
clock.
plan
Just
to
to make
just
sure a
chop
specific
4
bill
zeros off the
couldn't pass.
currency
Right.
by
They
March
literally
21,
weaponized
2026.
the clock.
I mean, if they were
under
holding
this
the
plan,
legislative process
10,000
hostage,
current
it makes
reals will
perfect sense
magically
why the
become
press
one
eventually
new
started
real.
calling them pirates.
Which is, I mean, purely
Which brings
a
us to
cosmetic
the actual
adjustment.
word
It changes the math on a
filibuster.
piece of paper
Yeah,
and makes
it's
the
easily
accounting
one of the
ledgers look
strangest words
slightly
in
less
American
chaotic, but it
politics.
does
So where does it
absolutely
come
nothing
from?
to change the
The
purchasing power of
etymology
the
is
citizen holding
fascinating,
that
honestly.
paper.
Nothing.
The term
To
really took
understand
hold
why
in
the
the
currency
1850s.
is failing,
It
you
comes
have
from
to
the
look at
Dutch
the
word
catastrophic
failure,
failure
within the
and the
banking
Spanish
sector
word
itself.
filibustero.
The sources
translates
highlight
directly
the
to
collapse
freebooter
of
or
Ayanda
pirate, right?
Bank as
Yes.
the ultimate case
Specifically,
study of this rot.
the mercenaries
let's look
and
at the mechanics
pirates
of
who
Ayanda Bank,
raided
because
Caribbean
this wasn't just
islands
some
and Latin
small
American
regional
countries
lender,
during
right?
that era.
This bank
So they were
held
calling
over
these
7%
distinguished
of
senators
all
pirates.
deposits in Iran.
Pretty much.
It was a major player.
The term entered
But
the political
reading through the
lexicon
autopsy
because
of how they used
observers
that money,
recognized the
it
behavior.
essentially operated like a national
senators who talked for hours were literally hijacking the Senate floor.
Like taking the government hostage, just like a pirate taking over a ship.
Dramatically higher than the legal limits.
So let's
But
track how
instead
the
of
Senate
taking that
tried to
deposited
fight off
cash
these
and making
legislative
sound,
pirates.
diversified loans
Because as the country
to,
grew,
say, small
you couldn't just
businesses
have
or
one person shut down the entire government
executives
for weeks
essentially
on
lent
end.
No,
billions
you
of
couldn't.
dollars to
But it took a
themselves.
long time to build a
Roughly
defense.
70%
By the
of the bank's
early 20th
total lending
century,
went to
these
a
marathon
single
speeches became
subsidiary company.
catastrophic
and
for
that
a
subsidiary
modernizing
was
nation.
tasked
I
with
can
building the Iran
So finally, in
Mall,
1917, President Woodrow Wilson pushed the Senate to adopt Rule 22.
The bank basically made a
This
massive
rule created a
concentrated
formal
bet
process
that
called
foreign
cloture.
investment
Cloture,
and luxury
okay.
brands
which is simply a mechanism to force an
But
end
the
to debate.
sanctions stayed in
But
place.
here's the catch.
And that investment
it
never
required
materialized.
a massive
So
two-thirds
the
majority
mall
vote
sits
to trigger.
mostly empty,
Two-thirds,
generating
which
no
is an
revenue,
incredibly steep hill
and the
to
bank
climb.
racks up
So stiff
$5.1
that over the next
billion
4
in
decades,
debt.
the Senate only managed to successfully invoke
To
cloture
cover the massive
5
losses,
times.
they just kept taking
That
in
is
new
wild.
deposits
Yeah.
to pay
Southern
the
senators
interest owed to the
famously
older
used this
depositors
exact tool
until
to
the central
block
bank
civil
finally
rights
forced them to
legislation for
liquidate.
years.
And if
The
they
gridlock
cannot
grew
sell an
so
empty mega
intense
mall,
that in
the central bank is forced to
1975,
just
the
print
Senate
the
lowered
missing
that
billions
threshold
to
from
make those
2/3
7
down
million
to
depositors
60
whole.
out of
Which
the
means
100
that newly
total
printed money
senators.
floods the streets.
Okay.
And directly
that 60
fuels
vote
that 70%
threshold is
food
the number that
inflation we talked
dominates our
about.
politics today.
But this brings up a
Exactly.
mechanical
But here's
question.
where I think a lot of
If
people
the
get
banks are
confused.
failing this badly,
When we hear the word
why can't the
filibuster,
central bank of
we don't
Iran
just think of a
just
60
use
vote
normal
math
economic
problem.
tools to
We
fix it?
picture Jimmy
What do you mean
Stewart
by
and
normal
Mr.
tools?
Smith goes to
Well,
Washington.
like
Right,
in other
the classic
countries, central
movie
banks
scene.
aggressively
we
adjust
picture a
interest
single
rates
person
or use
standing at a
standard
podium,
monetary
reading the
policies
phone
to
book,
cool off
sweating,
inflation or
refusing to
save
sit
failing
down.
banks. Why
But
not
senators
do that here?
rarely do
What's
that
fascinating
anymore.
here is
Why don't
the
they have to
ideological
physically talk
constraint
today?
placed on
That
the
is a
entire
crucial
financial
piece of the
system.
puzzle.
So
Back in
the
1980s,
the
Iran
Senate
amended its
something
banking
called the
rules to
two-track
fully
system.
comply with
Two-track
a
system. How did that work?
usury-free
Well,
Islamic
before the
finance
system,
framework.
a filibuster
see.
stopped
Yeah,
all Senate
they're
business
essentially the
completely.
only country in the
Nothing
world
else could
attempting
happen.
to run their
The Senate
entire
realized they had a whole
macroeconomic
country to run,
operations
so they
strictly
changed
by
the
these
procedure.
specific
Makes sense.
theological rules.
Under the
let me
new
make sure I'm
system, if a
grasping the
senator simply
mechanics here.
threatened to
This
filibuster a
framework
bill,
completely
the
bans
Senate leadership
predetermined
would just
interest
set that
rates, right?
controversial
The
bill
concept
aside
of
on a different
riba
track and move
or
on to
interest
other
is
business.
prohibited.
Oh, wow. So
Meaning
they made it
every
painless.
loan has to
You
operate
didn't have to
on a
stand up
profit
and
loss
destroy your
sharing
vocal
basis.
cords
That is the
anymore.
core
You just sent an
mechanism,
email
exactly.
saying,
But
I
by
object,
banning
and the bill
interest,
was
you
frozen.
inadvertently strip the
silent
central bank of
filibuster.
Iran
You capture
of
the
all
dynamic
standard
perfectly.
monetary
The
tools that a
physical
modern
endurance
economy
requirement
relies on to
basically
absorb
vanished.
shock.
But the physical
what?
records
Well,
from
for instance,
before
they
and
cannot use
outside that
discount
silent
windows. They
system,
cannot conduct open
those
market
remain
operations.
pretty
They cannot
legendary.
pay
Oh,
interest
absolutely.
on excess
Strom
reserves
Thurmond's
to
spoke
encourage
against the
banks
civil
to
rights
hold on to
act in
cash.
1957.
Okay, let's translate
for
those terms
24
for a
hours
second,
in
because that is
each
Imagine
crucial
finding
for you
out
to
your
understand
electric
hours.
listening
Is
and the
secretly
modern
funded
individual
discount
government
window
wants to
on
spend
Story
the central
Building.
bank
It
acting
does.
as a pawn
In
shop
April
for radio
2025,
banks,
Booker
lending them
spoke
cash
for an
overnight
astonishing
so they don't manage
25
bank
hours and
secretary. You
5
have a
minutes
savings account.
against the
And
policies
open
of the
market
Donald Trump
operations
administration.
involve the central
just
bank
think about the
buying or
bond
selling
reality
government
25
bonds
hours.
to
This
control
money
how much
restricts
cash is
down,
floating
you
around in
cannot
the
lean
economy.
on your desk.
You can't even leave the
Central
chamber
Bank of
for a
Iran's
bathroom
can't
break.
use
It is
any
a
of
house
these
of
standard
brutal,
stabilization
It's an
rules.
existential
Because
crisis for
every
the
single
House.
one of
Exactly.
them
It's the
saves the
relies
house
on
fund.
setting
Really
a
reminds me
baseline
of
interest
car
rate on a
breaks
speeding
down.
train.
Precisely the
Who
issue.
decides
So
groceries,
stripped
you got
of those
bills piling on
indirect
emergency
So what do you do?
market-based
Everyone
levers,
else into the
the
walls
central
just
bank is
because they
taking
don't
money
like the
off
final
your credit
destination.
cards and tell you
It is
that
a
they're
highly
fixed
disruptive
to legally
maneuver.
cap
Wait,
profit
that
rates
raises a
or
glaring
they
question,
strictly
though.
ration
The roof
who
is
gets
the
credit.
rule,
which was
is
massively
leaders
disruptive
to the
climate
climate
Oh,
crisis.
absolutely.
And the
Furthermore,
cause of majority
this
of
profit and
self-inflicted
loss-sharing
hates
system
at
creates a dangerously
$1.5
strong link
billion.
between the
Why
financial
haven't they just
sector and the
voted to
physical
destroy
economy.
it
Completely
permanently?
avoidable.
That
The
is a
massive
core
construction
Welcome to the
tension
deep
on the
dive.
United States Senate.
Today
The bank
we're
shares the
exploring
loss.
the
reason the
classification
filibuster
of fiscal
survives
sleight
is
of
that
hand
permanently
building out
destroying
of
it
that
requires a
buffer.
maneuver
And
so
looking at the
extreme
looking at
and
the
so
data
destructive
on
to the
those buffers,
institution
the
that it
Senate
earned
is
a
terrifying.
terrifying
It's a
nickname.
huge
The sources
pot of
show
money.
that Iranian
Exactly.
states
The
currently have
nuclear
a capital
options
asset
during
to
the
ratio
Cold War
of less
Let's
than
walk
5
through
to
the
equal
person
floor
Just for
mechanics.
context, international banking standards
actually
it
it
specifically
really
the
is
Basel
become
III
the center of a
framework fight, recommend that banks hold a democratic tenure, frustrated environment.
That issue is the financial shock absorber. It is the cushion of cash
critics
a
who
bank
are
needs to
rightly calling
survive.
this
Highly
whole thing a
polarized,
shell
a bunch of
game.
loans go bad at once. Securing when you look
Yeah,
at the
so
documents
Iranian
we
banks
have
are
today,
operating with a
reports,
5% shock absorber while dragging over a financial.
So they found a backdoor.
They are
really hard
loaded
to
with
backdoor.
toxic assets and non-performing loans. Follow the money. Central bank literally lacks the legal to see how a fund
The
designed
public
to
banking
fight
system
climate
is
change
fundamentally
is being
broken,
used to
First,
starved
the
for
Senate
cash,
Majority
and
Leader
constrained by
stands
laws
up.
We'll dig into
written
the
4 decades
argument that
ago.
it really
found
is.
money at
It
all.
This is where the
basically
math
tells the
stops at.
presiding officer that
The public
the
economy
written
is
rule
bankrupt.
means
Let's get
something
right into it. Banks have the
entirely different
strategic
than what
energy
the
buffer
text
and
actually
inflation.
says.
So the majority leader basically stands up and claims
essentially,
massive
on paper.
ongoing
Then the
military
presiding officer looks
conflict.
the
The state is firing
and says,
advanced
no,
ballistic missiles and drones, which cost millions of dollars, which is the only logical
reduce energy
response.
bills. But
How
here
is
is
a
the trend.
bankrupt
Fund
country
majority leader
funding a
immediately
high-tech
appeals
solar panels
to
and
solve that
efficiency
equation. We have to
Understand
move away
Senate
from the
perspective.
public
Here is
banking
the
system
real
entirely
and
and examine the
requires a
mechanics
simple
of the
majority
shadows
of
of money
51
Here's where it gets
so
really
the majority
interesting.
party
Because they aren't just
voting
The
taxes
reports
to
detail
override
the
the chair.
operation of a
And
massive,
the
and that's why
moment they get
politicians
51
absolutely
votes,
love
they
it. Talking about
establish a
hundreds of
brand
oil.
new
40%
binding
comes from
precedent
regional
that
carbon
completely
auctions.
overwrites
The mechanics
the
of this
bill
are
written
just
The one
wild.
growing like crazy.
That is
These
coming.
ships physically
They
disable their
rewrite the
automatic
rules
identification
using a
system
simple
for
majority.
ACPs.
So they
Which is just
disappear
a
in
fancy
the
government
67
term for
rate
fine.
requirement.
They forge their
Fire
bills of
failure.
lading.
Let me break
They
it down.
repaint their
Sitting down
hulls.
to play a board
Maryland
game,
law
conduct
forces
massive
utilities
right in the middle of a
companies
tight
to
ship
buy
oil
certain amounts
team
of
decides
green
to
energy
rewrite
and
the
improve
construction
their
just
use of
manual
renewables.
secretly
just because
sell
you happen to have
Primary
one extra
energy
player at
or
the
And
just
the
table.
primary
customer
customer
for this
But that
covert
guarantees
oil
retaliation.
Yeah,
Which
the state
The
gives
moment the other
sources
team
indicate
gets an
buys
extra
roughly
player,
90%
they're going
pay
to
a fee
rewrite the
directly
rules
to the
against
state
you.
instead.
The scale
And
is
if we connect this
industrial.
to the
One
bigger
investigation
picture,
cited
they
in
can
the
see how
stack
this
actually
weapon has
traced
steadily
utilities
grown
are
$1 billion
$1
or
billion
less
just
just
covert
paying
shipping
fine.
liability.
Every time a
Cheaper
party
than
pushes
single
that
insurance
button,
company
a new
operating
part of
out
the
of
Senate
So
shatters.
and the
It is
retaliation
a
just becomes more
massive,
severe.
highly
So track that
coordinated
escalation for us.
logistical
When does it start
undertaking
pressing?
designed
Because
specifically
green
to
energy
bypass
mandates
the
are
global
failing.
financial
Precisely.
system.
It is
The best way I can
Ted Lee
visualize this
previously
is
called it Hulk.
like
The
having a
government
house
made
with
the
two
mandate so
totally
aggressive,
separate,
but
isolated
nuclear
plumbing
stuck
systems.
because it implies
The military
companies are
and the
just
ruling
checks to
elite
the state instead
get a
of the first major
pristine,
launch
high-pressure
happened in
pipe
2013.
staggering
Democrats
fresh,
led by
hard
Harry
currency
Reid, 2020
directly from
this
Chinese
revenue was
oil sales.
$77 million.
Meanwhile,
So they
the
used
public
nuclear
gets a
option
leaky,
to drop
rusty
the
pipe filled with printed
351
fiat
votes
currency
for lower
that
court
dilutes in
judges
value
and executive
every
branch
single hour.
nominees.
And they explicitly left an exception for
Right.
executive
Now the
branch.
state
That
does.
analogy
But 4 years
perfectly
later,
captures the
in
dual
2017,
nature of the
balance of
Iranian
power
economy
for green
because the revenue
Republicans
generated by
led
that
by
goes
Remember,
to
that
the
money
does
didn't
not
just
enter
fall out
the
of the
normal
sky.
bank.
And they
At
retaliated
all.
for that all.
It completely bypasses
So they
and
fired
doing,
back.
you know, the global
They
messaging
used the
system
nuclear
that
option
banks
to
use wire
vaporize
money.
that
And
final
crucially,
absolutely
it
not. They passed
bypasses
every
pushing for
single penny of
nomination
that
in
on
your
their
course.
customers.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It shows
I'm
up
tracking
right
the
on your
fluctuations
bill.
in these
So
financial
you,
news. My
the
local
everyday
court nominees,
ratepayer,
I nuke
are
your
paying
Supreme
for
Court
the
into a
utilities
shadow.
and
And that
failures to
exact
meet
site
government
managed
mandates.
primarily by the
The state
Islamic
collects your
Republic
money,
of Iran, where the
drops it in the
IRGC
safe.
today
That is what the
in
look at all
March
this cash we
2026.
have. Right back to the
Which brings us
standoff
to
over
the
the
race.
Save America
massive
Act.
influx
Because
of
that money
oil
is definitely
oil
not
well
staying.
is ring
Democrats are
fenced,
fiercely
not anymore.
opposed to the
Enter
use of
Governor
silent
Wes
filibuster
Moore.
to freeze the
His
legislature.
administration
Now
is staring
Donald
down
Trump
a
and those
projected
28 Republican senators
$1.5
are
billion
doing the business of
They want to
development.
tear up that
Finances
comfortable
regional
two-track
$5
system and
billion,
enforce
and it
a
sustains
grueling,
You can't just ignore a
physical
hole that deep.
talking
Leaving the public
filibuster.
budget
And
They
when
wanna bring up
government
cuts
overspends
and
to
force
that
Democrats
degree,
to
they
public
start
budget is
checking
supposed
under
to
the
pay the
couch
teachers,
cushions for
they
loose
want to
change.
push the nuclear button again
Except here
and
is
subsidize
housing
the
and
filibuster for
energy
legislation
fund
food stamps
and the
like
loose
And this
change.
current crisis highlights
Because the
a
public sector
glaring
cannot
So what's
access
the
its
actual
own
proposal
nation
on
You brought
the
up
bill?
the public
The
fight
governor's
Islam
plan
Senator John
diverts
Cornyn and former
$292
Senator
million
Joe Manchin
sanctions
directly
directly
from
Cornyn
cannot
published the
institutions
op-ed
on
saying
general borrow
Republicans
money
must
and
just deal a
balance
fatal
the
blow
books.
to the
Just
rule
to
of
cover their
one
overspending.
catastrophic option.
Manchin
pointed out
They
we're
are
supposed to
using
compensate.
energy
Noting
funds
that
to
Cornyn
pay
used to
for
personally
general
thank him
government
for defending
operations.
that exact
Exactly.
same
Our state is essentially
salary,
treating
off
its
the
historical
supplies, you name
irony
it.
as a
But that's not
sacrificial
even all
crumple
of it.
zone.
Yeah.
I read in the
Clear,
sources there's also a
undeniable
rebate.
pattern
So the
emerges.
printing
Yes.
of the money is
This
the
is the
direct
part critics are
mechanical
calling a
cause of
political
Both parties
hyperinflation.
furiously
They're
defend
grabbing
the
another
filibuster when they are in the
$100
And the reports
million
also
out
highlight
of
They
the
give these
fund
soaring to give a
regional
one-time
markets to build
minority
$40
dollar
fortress
rebate
around
to
that
eligible
shadow
passions
wealth.
of the majority.
$40.
It's all
You're
traditional.
not.
So let me get this straight.
But the very
State
second they
mandates
secure the
drive up
51
energy
vote
costs $1
majority,
million.
they
The utility
furiously
companies
attempt
pass
to
those
impose
massive
another
costs
tether
to
and
you
their
and
own
me.
cryptocurrency
Our
paid
bills go up
directly
only
to the
hundreds
US
of
dollar.
dollars a
Right,
year.
so they have built a half
and then the governor takes a chunk of our own money,
exchange buffer,
hands us
Yeah.
back
Doesn't
a
we still
crisp
have it?
$40
That is the
bill,
million-dollar
and
question.
basically says, look at your
tax
welcome in
individual
2022.
exact holding more than
It's
$2,000.
And if you look at the
He faced
recent
immense
supplemental
political
budget,
pressure
they're
from
cutting
his
or
own
shifting
party.
another
He
$80
killed the
billion. When you
filibuster
add all this
after
up,
voting
this
on
raid
justice.
depletes the fund by
But he
82%.
refused disparity of the fund wiped out.
Actively
Leaving only about $164
shows
million
just
for the
this
actual
internal
green
economic
initiatives
rot
it was
is no
legally
longer
meant for.
contained within Iran.
That is not a
Why
trend.
on earth
That's
local
a political
financial
crisis
crisis
has
fundamentally
and this is where the
politics
gets
super
interesting.
Well, the
Because
answer
you
has
assume
very
the
clearly in the
environmentalist
blind
groups
tradition
like the
of
Sierra
center
Club or the
multidimensional. It is actually
Climate
rooted
Action
in joint
Network.
U.S. and Israeli
You
forces
assume they'd
and
be
African
furious.
strikes.
They
were,
yeah.
initially.
This dynamic is
When
brilliantly
this first
explained by
leaked, they
Stanford
called it
University
unacceptable.
developed
They said it was a
concept known as
huge
the
mistake
Mansion
to
paradox.
use
And
this
the
money
retaliation
as a
paradox
petty.
of Iran has launched waves of drone and missile strikes against
Now
targets
they are
across
actually
neighboring
supporting
Gulf
parts of the
cooperation
governor's
countries.
spending plan, specifically talking about the strange swing voter, like
Why
a
on
moderate
earth would they do
senator,
that?
right in
If
the
they
middle of the
truly
political
believe
party,
targeting changes in
actually
existential
gains
crisis,
significantly more
fundamentally
power
changes
when
the
a super
survival
majority is
of the
required.
entire
It's just
global
raw
supply
political
chain.
calculation.
Really
They
tough.
know
Let's bring
voters
this
are
down
getting
to the
crushed
ground.
by
Democratic
inflation and
leadership.
high energy
Why does a
prices
passive
right now.
massive war
If
in the
these
Middle
green
East matter
groups
to you?
attack
Let's say I
a
want to spend
$40
$10
rebate,
billion
even if it's a
away.
total $10
The
million,
answer lies in
they
the
look like they
narrow,
don't care about
30-mile
work.
wide
Now let's
strip of
say
so they have to
Senator
play
Manchin
they are
is the moderate swing swing
very
vote.
bitter
He thinks 10
in
billion
exchange
is
for
far
letting
too
the
much.
governor
His
raise the
ideal
fund
moderate
today.
target is
They are
under
lobbying
normal
for a new law
The
to
leadership
create a
wants 10,
funding
the moderate
fifth
wants
of the
4.
entire
That's
wealth
meaning
of
way
oil
tax.
liquids
Senate
and
would
a
not
mandate
vote
they
back.
want to guarantee
Simple majority
the
rule.
state will mandate
If I am the leadership
roughly
and I only need 51 votes to
$365
pass this, and
million
according to the
need to buy
Maritime
this
Management,
statute.
I walk into his office,
So they are throwing today's taxpayers under the bus to
insurance
lock down a
premiums for
permanent
each
claim on
mapped
your
out
wallet.
skyrocketed
That's
so
the
high.
gamble.
Leadership
And it brings us right into the core conservative critique to the ongoing Iranian
People like Senate Minority Leader
The macroeconomic shockwaves of that bottleneck are immediate and
Let's walk through
profound.
their argument. Because
The financial models in the source material outline a scenario where this disruption persists, resulting in a net supply loss of about 3.5 million barrels of oil per day.
And if that economic shortage
Right.
materializes,
Final
global oil
utilities
prices
can't
could
much
easily
closer, they
spike
pay the
into the
massive
hundreds to
fine.
$110 barrel range. Utilities
That
raise
hits
your
everyone
electric
at the
rates
spotlight
to cover the
very
cost.
loses the actual policy.
The state grabs that
so
fine
how
money
does
today
the
for the
general international finance, the
Well,
damage goes so
scenario
much
in
deeper than
effect,
just
the state
filling
is
up your
taxing
car.
electricity users to
They
pay for the
estimate a sustained
leadership
shock
to
at that
ally
level
on
would shave
without ever having to
0.6
publicly
percentage
vote on its
points
tax
off global
hike.
economic
Hershey says
growth.
Maryland
To
Which
put
means
that
they
in
have to find
tangible
those extra
terms.
9 votes
That means
somewhere.
central banks
Exactly.
around
And
the
to do
world
that, they have
And
to
then
be
you create
forced
this
the aisle
massive
and win
surge.
over
High.
moderate to fight off the new wave of energy
Mitt
Romney or
That
It's
means the
politically
interest rate on your
convenient.
mortgage
And
stays
there's a second
expensive,
layer to this
aggressive
criticism,
business
the
at
sheer
$10 billion
hypocrisy of
price
it. It
tag.
also
This is
triggers
before they
massive
even
capital
consider
flight,
voting
where
yes.
investors pull their money
Politicians
out of
constantly
emerging
talk
markets,
climate
Asia and
change
South
as an
America,
existential threat.
rushing to the
They say the
safety
world
of
is
the
burning.
US dollar.
So it
Code
acts
red
as a
for
massive
humanity.
The
regressive
gravitational
tax
pull
on
of
the
zero
entire
forces
global
the
economy.
leadership to
And
drop
it
the
does
price
not
tag
just impact
all
the
the way
energy
down
sector.
to, let's say,
It fundamentally
$6 billion.
impacts the global
Oh,
food
wow.
crisis.
Here's
Right.
This is the connection that really stuns me.
$6 billion
Liquefied natural gas isn't just used to heat
mansions.
homes.
You don't raid
Natural
your
gas
birthday
is the
surgery
primary
fund to pay off
chemical
your credit
feedstock
card. That is the
required
grand
to
reveal
produce
of
nitrogen-based
the whole
fertilizer.
climate
By
panic is
vigorously
just rhetoric.
protecting the
If the
60
LNG
vote
shipments
filibuster
out
of major
keeping
intentionally
government
gives our
bureaucracy
glamorous
fully
status
funded
and
is
leave
way
ultimately
more
important to
deciding
them
the
than the
European
green
and
projects they
Asian
claim. But by
fertilizer
doing
plants
so,
that rely
he
on that
forces
gas
the
to
entire
have to
Senate
shut down
to pull the
or
legislation
entirely
significantly
undermines
closer
their
to
moral
expensive
goals.
fertilizer means
If
the
the money
cost of
isn't
farmer
sacred,
that is
then the
incredibly
crisis
west
clearly
South
isn't as
America
urgent as they
significant
claim it
mathematical
is.
sense.
Let's
By
talk
looking
about
at
the
the
real
real
world
world less important that final vote
because
while politicians are moving hundreds of millions around on spreadsheets of bread in your
He
local,
gives
it affects
away
the
his raw
actual
voting
grid.
leverage
funding
to
the
What gets
shadow
left
immense
behind
is
when you
literally
drain
choking
82%
the
of
global
the fund?
economy.
It's
Well,
all
programs
connected.
for electric
Global
heat pumps for
macroeconomic
low-income
data
households
is
study
grim.
proves
But
that
to
moderate
truly grasp
politicians
the scale
defend
of
the
that
60
collapse,
vote rule
we have to look at
because
the
it
human
acts
cost
as a
of people
permanent
in the streets of
gravitational
Tehran.
pull.
Instead,
They're
forcefully
sacrificing
state of the social
long-term
infrastructure
legislation
from either end of the spectrum
political
widespread social
that
unrest
that
has
completely
sweeping across
reorients how
major
you view
Iranian
the
They're also
gridlock
cutting
in
electric
Washington.
school buses, induction
When we
stoves.
see
We are
these
looking at
threats
verified
and
but
here's
here's
the
the
ultimate
ultimate
reality. It is
reality.
not just politicians
Even before
acting
this
like
rate,
petulant
with all
These are the
massive
veterans
there
who
was
fought
vigorous
with
mathematical
mathematical
strategy
behind the
hitting
1980s.
targets.
They're holding
No,
signs
when you
and
understand
not even
close
phrases
theory,
like
you realize
yesterday's
now
winners
actors
are
and
today's
today's
parliamentary
parliamentary
order
and openly shouted
that
that
there
there
are
are
all
massive
economic
levers
numbers
in a
but
highly
a University of
Their state
Maryland
pensions
analysis
that
shows that
are
under
going
current
entirely
policies, the
unpaid.
state
Have
is
covered
only going to
more
get
the money
40
they do
to
receive.
45%.
Journeys of
They are
Caribbean
miles
pirates
behind.
hijacking the
So we are missing
the
the
target.
target.
The grid is
Like
getting
the
more
creation of the
expensive.
silent two
And
tracks
now
And faced with,
the money
because
in politics
in a modern
is
economy, the
25
internet is not a
hours
luxury
fund
for
to
quiet
cover
occasion
deficit.
or social
Yeah,
media.
and we mapped out
Is
the
the
parliamentary
fundamental
cheat code of
administration
nuclear
says they
action.
can walk and chew
Explored the
gum at the
explosive
same time,
2026
meaning
showed
balanced
provided
budget
a
and
staggering
planet.
statistic. And finally,
But
estimate
you
there are
can't drain the fuel tank
500,000
and
proves
expect
gridlock
your
is
car
actually
to finish
working
line.
in moderation. And think about
The
grid
mechanics of the
stability.
Senate are
Because
complex.
international
But
sanctions
the
block
underlying
access
human
to
strategies
platforms like
remain
Amazon or
remarkably
Shopify,
consistent
penalize
throughout.
Regular
reliable
citizens,
energy
why this
sources,
deep
especially
dive
when
costs
it's
explode,
explode,
and the
have
grid
built
gets
entire
fractured.
livelihoods
That's exactly
selling
why those
clothes,
fines are
crafts,
so
and
high.
senators
Reliable green
exclusively
energy
to
just
the
isn't
home.
available.
So when the
Demanding
state
the nuclear
throttles the
option,
bandwidth or
you
so
now
the state is
hold the
literally
secret
penalizing the grid.
You know what's actually
traffic
going on
those
behind
half
And
a
instead,
million
you know
fictional
that it's not
storefronts
just
dropped
random
in
partisan
thousands.
meeting the mandates
Let's
are
walk through
unreal.
how
It's
that
a high bankrupt
government
of matches.
Imagine you run a small clothing shop calculating exactly
Which brings us back to the
credit
most disturbing part of
supplier
this
and
whole
exactly
data.
how far they
Versus
dresses every day
before the entire system shatters.
Suddenly, the internet
And
goes
honestly,
down.
the stakes right now in 2026 have never been
message
higher.
customers.
Every
and
time a new
crucially,
precedent is
you cannot
established, and the
process
green
delays.
Senate edges closer to
cash
becoming
IT
a simple
experts
majority
noted
body.
that
Utilities are
Entirely
businesses are
using
going
unique
bankrupt rapidly.
moderating
So if
design
utilities
policies
literally
over
cannot
centuries.
process
Somehow,
sales
which brings us to a final thought of the
100%
physical
checks they already wrote to their
We
supplier.
constantly
The
complain
blackout
about
is
government
wiping out
budget
an
loss. We hate the
30
frustrating
trillion rubles a day
Exactly.
when it blocks the
The government now
specifics of
has
what
a
it is
massive
desperately
financial
wants
This
to
raises
invest.
an
Everyone
important
hates it when it's
question,
used
one that
against them.
points
It's
to
the
the
utility
core
to see
underlying
filibuster
revenue
is
system of the
actually a mechanical
geographical
tool.
analysis.
And the governor is left
To
with
me,
extreme
looking at all
rigors
this
to
data, it means
moderate
we are watching the
compromise. That is
total
just
and complete
wild. Maybe
collapse
written
of
a
the
massive
social
conflict
contract.
of interest
Historically,
over
many
the state
authoritarian
It's a
budget.
total
Presidents
dependency
ability
on
to
failure.
tacit,
The
unspoken
state needs
agreement
dirty
to
energy
contain power.
fines to
The
pay
public
its
accepts
daily
heavy
bills.
restrictions
It's like
on
a doctor
political
who
and
only gets
social
paid
freedoms
if the
the patient
And in
state.
exchange,
A single
the
vote
state
in the
provides
U.S.
economic
Senate can
stability,
freeze the most
guaranteed
powerful government on
employment,
earth.
and heavily subsidized
But right
basic
now,
goods.
But the
a
state
political
has completely
standoff
broken
threatens
their
to
end
blow
of
up
the
the
deal.
rules forever.
They made a
Yeah,
cold,
we are watching the
calculated
fundamental
mathematical
machinery
decision.
of
They
American
chose to
lawmaking
prioritize
just
their hard currency,
grind
that shadow
to an
budget from the
absolute
Ghost
halt.
Fleet,
And honestly, the
entirely
physical
for the
toll on
security
the people
apparatus
inside
and the
that building
military.
is about to become
They
very
abandoned
real.
the mechanisms
Right, so
that
let's set the
subsidize
scene.
basic
It's
necessities,
March 2026.
leaving the everyday population
Picture the
to face
hallways of the
70%
United States
food
Capitol
inflation
right now.
alone without a
Aides
safety
are
net.
literally
You have an
dragging
elite class
military-style
utilizing
cots
a
into
$507 million
Oh, yeah.
cryptocurrency
Staffers are
buffer to
stockpiling
protect their
energy drinks
wealth
by the case.
and
Exactly.
effortlessly
We are looking at a
float above
scenario
the
where
domestic
senators might
inflation.
actively
While the everyday
refuse to drink
citizen is
water
reduced to
just so
hoarding
they don't have to leave the
non-perishable
floor to use
canned
the
food
restroom.
and
Which is
desperately trying to
wild,
buy
and it's all
tiny
because the
scraps of
Senate is
physical gold
completely
just to survive the
deadlocked over
freefall
the
of the
Save
rial.
America
Which
Act.
brings us to the
election
end of our
overhaul
journey
bill.
through
Yeah.
the stack
It's centered
of
around
reports
measures
today.
like voter
We started
ID
by looking at a
requirements.
piece of pink paper.
Democrats are aggressively
10 million
blocking
in
this
pre-legislation
legislation, born of
and
panic,
Republicans
and
desperately
worth just
want to pass it.
$7.
But they lacked
We traced
the
how a
60
banking
votes
system,
required to break the
crippled by a
stalemate.
lack of modern
Which means
monetary
frustrations
tools
are
and
just
1983
boiling over.
ideological constraints,
Today, you
failed
have
its
28
depositors.
Republican senators,
We uncovered
people
the
like
dual
Pete
plumbing of
Ricketts
the shadow
and Cynthia
economy,
Loomis,
where a
demanding
fleet of
that the
tankers
Senate
secretly
force
funds
a
a massive
grueling
war
physical
while the public
talking
budget stars.
filibuster.
They
And we
want to
followed
force
the
Democrats to
macroeconomic
stand on the
shockwaves of
floor
that
and
war as it
talk
choked
until
off
their
the Strait
vocal
of
cords
Hormuz,
just give
threatening
out.
And if
global
that
oil
fails,
supplies
they
and
want
your
to break
grocery
the
bill.
standing rules
All
of the
while
Senate
the Iranian middle
entirely to
class
force
is
a final
crushed
vote.
under the
And the
dual
real
weight
shocker
of
dropped
hyperinflation
just a few days
and
ago.
digital blackouts.
Senator John Cornyn,
So leaving you
a
with
man
a final
who
thought
fiercely
to mull
defended
over,
the old Senate
building on the
rules for his
sources,
entire career,
looking at the
just
sheer
published
scale
this
of the ghost
fiery
fleets,
op-ed.
the
Right,
untraceable
saying Republicans
ship-to-ship
must act now
transfers,
to get this bill
and
passed.
the
Yeah, he said they had to
$500
deal a
billion
fatal
in
blow to the
decentralized
rules,
cryptocurrency.
which instantly triggered
It
a massive
really
public
makes you
call out from former
evaluate
Senator
the
Joe
underlying
Manchin.
mechanics
Manchin
of modern
slammed
financial
Cornyn online
warfare.
for,
If a
a
nation's
massive
ruling
flip-flop.
elite
Because the
can
rules of the Senate are
completely
quite
insulate
literally
themselves
hanging by
from
the
the thread
collapse
right
of their
now.
own
I mean, the
public
decisions
currency
made
by
in the next few
building a
days will
digital
dictate
and
how
maritime
American
laws
life
are
will
written for the next
Do
century.
traditional economic
Welcome to
sanctions
this deep
actually work
dive.
the way they were intended?
Today,
Or do
we
they
have
now
a
merely
custom
serve to
mission
punish
tailored
the
just for
everyday
you.
citizens who are
We're
locked
going
out
to
of that
explore the
lifeboat, leaving the targeted
swashbuckling,
regime's
pirate-filled
shadow
origins
operations
of the
entirely
filibuster.
untouched?
It is a
Exactly.
crazy
That is a
history.
profoundly
It really
heavy
is.
thought to sit with.
We'll also break
and
down
exactly
the
the
terrifying
kind of
parliamentary
structural question
weapon
we need
known
to be
as the
asking when we
nuclear
look at
option.
global policy. And finally, we
Thank
will
you for joining
unpack
us on
a
this deep dive into
mind-bending
the
mathematical
data.
concept
Keep asking the hard
called
questions,
the
keep digging
Manchin
into the mechanics of the
Right,
world around
which
you,
proves
and
exactly
we
why
will see you next
politicians
time.
use